In the early 1900s, steamships flooded Ellis Island with hopeful immigrants, each carrying stories of hardship and dreams of freedom. They came from all corners of the world, drawn to America by the promise of a new life. But before anyone set foot on US soil, they had to pass through inspections. Officials would scan the masses for signs of illness, and if they spotted so much as a fever, the sick would be pulled aside, taken to a place no one wanted to go. A place called Swinburne Island, a grim quarantine station just miles from the mainland. And once someone was sent there, they didn't always come back. This is the story of the one ship whose journey to Ellis Island brought a nightmare with it, one that would vanish from the records and be buried under a century of silence. Our story begins one foggy morning as Ellis Island's guard, Thomas Reed, stood on duty. The docks were always bustling, with families shouting, children laughing, everyone anxious to start their new life. But on this day, as the sun tried and failed to break through a heavy fog, Thomas noticed something odd. There was a ship, a massive steamer, barely visible through the mist, drifting silently toward the dock. Thomas knew the sounds of steamers well, the creak of metal, the hum of engines, the chatter of passengers. But this ship was different. It was silent. No engines, no voices, no lights. It was just gliding forward like a ghost. As the fog thinned, he could see the size of the vessel, a hulking grey shadow against the grey sky. Yet not a single soul moved on deck. Dock officers called out, trying to get a response from the ship. Nothing. No one even peeked over the railings. Growing anxious, they sent out tugboats to stop it from colliding with the dock. When they managed to steady it, a team of officials and guards, including Thomas, climbed on board. They were expecting the usual, perhaps a technical malfunction or an unwell crew. But what they found on board would haunt them forever. The first thing they noticed was the smell. It was thick, sickly, like rotting meat and sweat. A smell that clawed at the back of your throat. As they moved deeper into the ship, they realized the crew had barricaded themselves in the upper cabins. When they broke through the doors, the crew's eyes were wide with terror. They told the officials they'd locked themselves away because the passengers below were sick. But this wasn't any ordinary illness. The crew's voices trembled as they described seeing shadows, hearing whispers from the sick at night. Sometimes even laughter. Ignoring the cries of the terrified crew, Thomas and the doctors pressed on, descending into the lower decks. That's when they saw the passengers. Rows of them, slumped over, eyes glassy, laying motionless. Some were barely conscious, muttering in delirium, as if seeing things that weren't there. The doctors looked at each other, their faces pale, and quickly decided everyone on this ship, crew and passengers alike, would have to be quarantined. They set course for Swinburne Island. Swinburne wasn't like any hospital. It was a fortress of cold stone walls and high windows. Once the patients were inside, they weren't leaving unless they were cleared of all symptoms. But the crew protested, begging the officials to let them stay somewhere else. They spoke of the passengers mumbling, the twisted shadows they'd seen in the darkness. But the officials brushed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion and fear. The patients were lined up on cots, row after row, with a thick wall separating them from the guards. Thomas Reed, still on duty, could hear the sounds through that wall, anguish, moans, sometimes even strange laughter, perhaps through hallucinations. Dr. Alistair Graves, the head doctor, and nurse Margaret Hale tried to keep things under control. But each day their reports became more concerning. By day 5, Dr. Graves' reports mentioned patients hallucinating, seeing shadows in the corners, and some writhing in their beds with their mouths wide open, gasping as if for air. By the 7th day, the reports stopped entirely. Thomas waited by the glass divider, anxious, watching for any sign of Dr. Graves or Nurse Hale. And finally, on the 11th day, Dr. Graves appeared. He looked hollow, defeated, his hands trembling as he handed over his report. Inside, he'd written that the patients weren't sleeping. They were seeing things. Some had twisted their bodies into impossible shapes, eyes wide open, mouths frozen in silent screams. As he read the report, Thomas felt a chill shoot down his spine. The sickness was spreading, and no one knew how to stop it. Finally, the officials gave the order no one wanted to hear. Total lockdown. No one in or out. No supplies, no laundry, nothing. More guards were stationed at the exits, with strict orders to keep the building sealed. As the days passed, the sounds inside faded into a suffocating silence. But something else was wrong. Thomas noticed he hadn't seen Dr. Graves, Nurse Hale, or any of the staff in days. After a week of complete silence, Thomas sent a report to the officials, begging for answers. In response, they ordered him and a small group of guards to enter the quarantine building to see what was happening inside. They prepared themselves for the worst, donning protective gear, knowing full well they were walking into the unknown. But nothing could have prepared them for what they found. As soon as the door creaked open, a wave of foul air hit them, thick and oppressive. It was a smell that stuck to your throat, sickly sweet, like rotting flesh, mixed with the metallic bite of blood. It was so strong, even through their masks, it made their eyes water. But they pressed on. What else could they do? The corridor was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of their boots on the cold floor. The building was dark, only the faint glow of flickering overhead lights cutting through the gloom. But the longer they moved, the more oppressive the air became, thick with something unspeakable. Then they reached the main room. What they found was like something out of a nightmare. Bodies were sprawled across the floor, their limbs bent at unnatural angles, twisted into grotesque shapes, as if they had been thrown aside by something invisible and violent. Some had collapsed in heaps, their faces contorted in terror, as though they'd been trapped in the most horrifying of moments. Eyes wide open, staring at nothing, at something that wasn't there. Their mouths were stretched into silent screams, frozen in the last agonizing expression of their lives. But it wasn't just the patients, the nurses, the attendants. They were all there, scattered among the dead, their faces locked in the same horrific expression. Their eyes were wide, glassy, staring ahead as though they'd seen something they couldn't understand, something that had torn the very essence of their sanity to pieces. As they made their way to Dr. Graves's office, one question loomed larger and larger. Where was the doctor? They reached his office at the end of the ward. Everything was in place, except for one thing. High on the wall, a small narrow window was open. It was impossible to reach without climbing, and yet it was wide open. Somehow, Dr. Graves was gone. The authorities launched a search across every inch of Swinburne Island. They scoured the buildings, the shoreline, and even the rocky cliffs, but there was no trace of Dr. Graves. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. With no other choice, the officials made a final grim decision: destroy everything. The guards were ordered to burn it all: the bodies, the records, even the silent ship that had drifted into their harbor. And so, the flames were set. They consumed the island's dark history, and thick black smoke rose into the sky, taking with it any trace of the sickness and the horrors it brought. But as the last embers died out, the officials gave one final command: to never speak of what had happened on Swinburne Island. Thomas couldn't help but wonder, where did the ship come from? And what sickness did it bring with it? And what of the good Dr. Graves? In the end, we'll never know.